speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
Thank you, Irving. That is the love chapter. There's also a whole book on love, which we never read in church because it's inappropriate. Leave you to your Bible to find that one if you want to look it up. If you were lived in ancient Judaism, they're not allowed to read that book until they were at least 30 years old. So if that hasn't piqued your interest, we're not going to. But anyhow, we are continuing our series on strong bonds. And it is important, as the title of our series suggests, in all of our relationships, to cultivate strong bonds with one another. We started off last week with teams in honor of the Super Bowl, but we're also reminded that in our life, we are a part of teams in a lot of different areas. One of the most important teams, and I would argue, I think the Bible also argues, the most important team in your life here on earth is with your spouse. And so that's our focus today. But let me say as a caveat, if you don't have a spouse, please don't check out. I'm going to give you a couple quick sales pitch reasons not to check out if you don't have a spouse. Number one, someday you might. And this might come in handy. Someday you might meet somebody who has a spouse and is struggling with that spouse, and you might be able to offer some wisdom to them. Particularly if you've been married in the past, if you're one of our widows or widowers, you have a unique opportunity to breathe into other people's relationships. Right, so that's an opportunity to listen as well. Or perhaps you're a lot more experienced in life than I am, and I still appreciate you listening because you can let me know where I'm going wrong and where I could use your assistance. My wife would also appreciate if you could give me that assistance. So we come to our first slide that says this. Is our relationship, is our love, is the way that we are interacting with one another producing a beautiful chord? I mentioned the orchestra at Concordia. I mentioned our band right here. They work hard to harmonize well, and it sounds good. Trevor Dietrich and I had a lot of fun at Christmas playing our saxophones. We had some different collections of music we worked with. Some of them worked great, and it sounded amazing. Other times, we played them and went, let's not play that song. We got the wrong music for that. That is not a chord. That is something obnoxious. It sounds instead like obnoxious clatter. So in our relationship, are we making a beautiful chord, or is it obnoxious clatter? We start out with some of the most humbling passages in the Bible about men and women in relationships. And the first one comes from our reading we just heard from 1 Corinthians 13. Paul says this. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, my speech sounds beautiful. He says, but I do not love. He says, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Maybe some of you remember the Gong Show. Right? When you heard the gong, that was not a good thing. Right? Gongs do not make a beautiful sound. By design, they are obnoxiously annoying. They're made to get your attention. They're kind of like your alarm clock in the morning. That is their purpose. And most people don't want to marry an alarm clock or a gong. And so we don't want to be that. We don't want to be unloving towards one another. And I think Paul directed this at men, right? We're the ones who tend to lack love or not quite know how to express it. And so we don't want to sound to our wives like a gong. Next, sorry ladies, but from Proverbs chapter 27, it says this: a nagging wife is like a dripping of a leaky roof in a rainstorm. Or other translations say like a leaky faucet. Drip, drip, drip. That's considered torture in a lot of different cultures to listen to that. And it says this: stopping her is like trying to stop the wind. It is like trying to grab olive oil with your hand. So guys, we don't want to sound like a clanging gong. Ladies, we don't really want to be like a dripping faucet, do we? I know at our house, when a faucet drips, my wife asks me very kindly to please fix it. Because it is an annoying sound. And so we don't want to be that to each other. But here's the difficulty, is that we don't do these things on purpose. Right, guys, raise your hand if you're set out to sound like a gong in your house. Ladies, raise your hand if you... okay, one. All the rest of us don't set out to do that. But raise your hand if you ladies like to sound like a dripping faucet and be annoying. No, we don't try to do that. Uh-oh. Okay. We don't try to do that, but it just happens because we're different. And we're not really that great at relating to each other. We're not that great at building those strong bonds. Here's part of the challenge. Our next slide shows us ways that a lot of guys like to bond. This is our shameless plug for our men's trip coming up. Right? Guys like to bond side by side. And ATV makers discovered that, and they started putting seats side by side so that guys could bond out in the woods. However, I discovered in my own life that ladies don't really like to bond side by side. Now, I was a kid. My parents took me out to a fancy dinner. I was sitting across from my mom, and I think we were eating fish, and I had a lemon, and I was trying to apply the lemon to the fish. However, instead I applied the lemon juice to my mother, because she was sitting across the table from me. And she suggested to me that if I ever go on a date, I sit next to my date, so I don't apply lemon juice to them across the table. And that sort of instilled that idea of bonding side by side. And Brittany and I have even blessed over the last couple of months. We've spent a lot of time side by side doing things together. Some of it's been work, some of it's been family stuff. We're doing a lot of stuff together. And I'm like, man, this is great. We are really bonding. This is excellent. This is almost like a date. And during a discussion recently, as my wife was sharing some clarity with me, I discovered that none of those things were bonding experiences for her. It was weird. And she actually did not consider any of those to be anything like a date, because we were side by side. You see, if women were to design one of these things, it would look more like the next picture. Like this. A tandem bicycle where you can get some FaceTime. And I'm pretty sure a woman actually designed the application FaceTime, because that's what it's all about, spending time face to face. And before you laugh, what tends to happen is instead of these bonding experiences, we actually get the next picture of a tandem bicycle where we are trying to go in opposite directions, which does not lead to strong bonds. Right? Imagine trying to ride that bike, it actually leads to frustration. And I put in a special request, and next week, weather permitting, hopefully we don't, well, I guess our world like more rain, but if we don't have rain, Gary and Janie have offered to bring their tandem bicycle. It is not designed like that, but it's equally difficult to ride, I discovered. And we're going to offer free marriage counseling for anybody who would like to attempt riding a tandem bicycle next Sunday after church. It'd be a great way to step forward. Next Sunday also, we're going to be having an opportunity, if you'd like to renew your vows, we're going to do that right here in church as a part of our service in the morning. And then you can hopefully not undo them on the tandem after church. But it's difficult. It's hard for us to figure out how to bond together as couples. And I was doing some research and preparing for this and trying to figure out how do we do that. And I found a great resource. It's actually called awesomemarriage.com. It's led by a guy who used to be a part of Life Church. They're the people who put together the YouVersion Bible app that a lot of us use. They've got some great devotions on there. And he suggests that having a great marriage was as easy as paying attention to road signs. Now, that's a great idea, road signs, because both men and women equally own for themselves being the better driver, right? I drive better than my wife does. My wife contends she drives better than I do. I don't know if some of you had similar discussions, but that's how it usually goes. So why not just pay attention to road signs? Our first road sign that we come across in a relationship is the yield sign. To yield. Dr. Kim is the man behind AwesomeMarriage.com. He's done some great counseling and some great programs over the years. There's actually a link at the bottom of your page if you want to dive into some of his resources. He's got a great podcast available. But he says this about yielding in his life. He says, first of all, whenever he's driving and he pays attention to a yield sign, he has not gotten into an accident. Now, he doesn't go on to say whether or not he did have an accident by not paying attention to a yield sign, but a lot of people do. Right, that's one of the most dangerous things here in Eastville is we have 2 stoplights that don't have a left turn thing, and there's an accident there almost every week. Because someone doesn't yield and there's an oncoming car, right, and we have a collision if we fail to yield to others. Dr. Kim also pointed out he has never had a fight in his house if he is following the yield sign and yielding to his wife and not being selfish about himself. However, he seems to confess that there are times he does not follow the yield sign and a charismatic argument does in fact ensue. So we turn to our attention now from 1 Corinthians. Says this, 1 Corinthians 13. It says, talking about love, it says it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. Self-seeking. That's the opposite of yielding. Why do accidents happen over there on 65th Street? Because people are self-seeking. They want to turn left because they feel that is more important than allowing the oncoming traffic to come past them first before making that left turn. And we are self-interested because a lot of harm to other people. But there are great opportunities in marriage for us to yield to one another, to set aside the things that are most important to us and think about what might be most important to our spouse. In the midst of all of those side-by-side activities Brittany and I were engaged in, I should have thought for a minute and yielded to some of those needs for face-to-face time, and perhaps would have avoided the next phrase in the sentence. It is not easily angered. That's what yielding does. When we yield to each other, we are not easily angered. And then last but not least, probably the most difficult one in a relationship is this. It says it keeps no record of wrongs. That's hard to do, isn't it? Now I know, ladies, men have often been accused of not having great memories, or at least I have. I forget a lot of stuff. And oddly enough, I have a pretty good ability to remember the times I have been injured in my life and in our relationship. That's odd, isn't it? It's like our memory never works except for the things we would probably better off to forget. And John says that love does not keep a record of those wrongs. It pauses for a bit and lets the other person go first. Paul puts it this way a little bit later on. And it's interesting, he connects these in the same chapter, nearly the same paragraph. He says this. When he talks about love, he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. And he says, when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Because what he suggests is that our childish, our selfish ways are unloving towards other people. They are self-loving, they are self-focused, interested in my own needs and my own interests. However, I'm much less interested in the needs of others. And as time goes on, he desires maturity for us. That we begin to be more interested in other people's needs than our own. We're reminded about Jesus was much less interested in the needs of Jesus than he was in the needs of his people. It might shock you, but God himself doesn't even have a lot of needs. But Jesus had some when he was here on earth. And the major needs that Jesus seemed to feel for himself was alone time. He spent most of his time with his 12 disciples and about 70 or so other people. And there were times he needed to be alone, especially after he had been with a large crowd and done things for them. Several times, Jesus removed himself from the situation and went to a solitary place to pray. And most of the time when Jesus did that, guess what happened? When he got there, he wasn't alone. There were about 1,000 people around who wanted to eat. And what does it say? Jesus had compassion on them, and he forgot about the time he needed, and he instead took care of their needs. Jesus has, of course, reached a level of maturity we will never reach, but it's worth pointing out that that's what maturity looks like, is beginning to yield to other people. I won't say I haven't done it recently, but I do remember a very early trip in my dad's truck, and my mother sitting next to me. I think I had a permit, and there was one of those pesky lights in our town, just like there is here, that doesn't have a left turn arrow. And by the grace of God, I made a left turn without yielding, and somehow the oncoming cars stopped before reaching us. And it was one of the most frightening experiences of driving ever in my life. It was a pretty busy street, and I failed to yield. But hopefully in our life we learned to start to do that, to yield to each other. Another great passage about marriage is this from Ephesians chapter 5. And it begins and it talks about the roles of men and women individually. We'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But it begins with this heading. Pay attention to this. It says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, guys, you're right. It does say later on, wives, submit to your husbands. But long before it says that, it says submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That men and women both should frequently come to yield signs in our relationship. And yield to each other. And learn to put the other person first. Learn to discover a little bit more about we than focusing on me in our relationships. We come to the next sign, and it is oddly similar, but it says this: slow down. Why do you see that sign? Anybody know? Why does that sign show up as you're driving? Probably because there's something dangerous coming ahead. All right, we were blessed to go a trip recently up to Big Bear with our family. There were a lot of these signs. Why? Because there were tight turns with steep drop-offs. And not obeying the sign would have been catastrophic. Same thing in our life together with our spouse. There are times we need to slow down. What could that mean? It can mean a lot of different things to slow down. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says this. It says, love is patient. Love is patient. It is not in a hurry. There's few times in our life together we really need to be in a hurry. There's a lot of danger in that. I can't remember the name of the movie. There was a movie a long time ago with, I think it was Jim Carrey, and it was about a remote control. And he had a remote control for his life, and he could fast forward through the parts that were not that interesting to him. And he discovered he had missed a lot of important things by fast forwarding through them. Maybe in our own life, we tend to hit fast forward and try to get through things quickly, and we should instead slow down and try to understand a little bit more deeply. Love is patient. Maybe there's times in our life with our hectic schedule that we need to slow down and release some of those things in our schedule so we have more time to spend together, more time with our children, more time to focus on what is most important to us. It also goes on to say this. It says, love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. Slowing down means paying deep attention to one another. Slowing down means this. It means not rushing to judgments. It also means not rushing to decisions and not rushing to reach the outcome that we want for ourselves or for our life. Here's a brilliant man. His name is Malcolm Gladwell. And he's written a lot of different books about how people do things, about trying to explain some of the phenomenons, like why some people are incredibly more skilled than others, and it turns out to be an equation of how much time they spend doing something, and they gain mastery over that. He has a very fascinating book entitled Blink. And he suggests in that book that most of our best decisions are actually made in the blink of an eye. Maybe we hem and haw over them for a long time. Maybe we have a hard time making decisions. He says most of our best decisions are made in the blink of an eye. He goes in a lot of detail about what he refers to as intuition. And he says intuition is not actually some miraculous thing, but it's actually your brain putting together all the events you've experienced in your life and the gleanings you have learned from those, and that intuition is actually your brain's ability to connect all those dots very quickly and make a decision. Malcolm Gladwell is a smart guy, and I love all of his books. But Paul and God himself seems to suggest when it comes to the most important relationship in our life, maybe we need to pause the blink speed decisions and hold off for a moment and think about whether or not that serves us, whether it would be better for us to try listening much longer, to try to understand one another. Maybe not to respond, not to direct decisions, but to stay curious long enough to see if there might be some other solution. There might be some other option. There might be some other alternative that is better for us than the one that we would most be inclined to jump right to. And if we pause from jumping to those conclusions, we might have an opportunity to build stronger bonds. Maybe we have a tendency to want to be the decision maker. But if we were instead the decision supporter or the spouse supporter, that might earn us some better bonds with them than simply directing. Perhaps if we set our intuition aside for a moment and we're instead to investigate, to seek other options, we'd be well served by that. There's a great tool we use, that I use for premarital counseling. We use it in marriage counseling. It's called Prepare and Enrich. Use the prepare part before you get married, use the enrich part after. But they both use the same, rather lengthy, 10-step conflict resolution form. And in one of those 10 steps is to not jump to conclusions, but is to push pause and instead investigate what might be other options. Solutions neither party has ever thought about. A little bit more difficult, there's also an opportunity there to investigate how I contributed to the problem, but we won't get into that. But thinking for a moment and slowing down even our decisions, slowing down our conversations to understand each other is important. And one last thing I want to throw in here is this, is part of that 10-step process is actually not to have those important conversations in the heat of the moment, but to slow down and find a time when tempers aren't raised, when there isn't some deadline we need to get to, where we can actually sit down and try to understand each other and seek a positive solution rather than continue to heap more coals on one another. We're reminded, we come to the end of this chapter 13. It says this. It talks about love always. That's a great command for us to love each other always. But one of the things maybe you've started to see is that there is difficulty in living together, isn't there? There's seasons where we go along hunky-dory. There's seasons where everything seems to be falling apart. Our love is not all that consistent. That's why we need somebody from outside of just a husband and wife to come in and give us more opportunity to love. That's what God has done in His Son. That's why He sent Jesus Christ into our world. I encourage you to reread this 1 Corinthians chapter 13 as part of our kind of homework this week and think about this. But it says this. It says, love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres. Love never fails. You can borrow my Histories for Dummy book, one of my favorite history books, from my library, and you would find in there only one person in history who always does the right thing, who always chooses to protect, who always holds out hope, and who never, ever in their life failed at anything. That one person is Jesus Christ. When we read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we think about that ideal of love as we come up on Valentine's Day. The only ideal of love is Jesus Christ. Every loving action we can think of, every selfless act we can think of, is shown us the best in our Lord Jesus Christ. In his completely selfless act upon the cross, his completely selfless act, his entire life, everything he did was for you. He did nothing for himself. Even after he gave his life for us, he took a moment to have a meal. Did you know that? He ate some fish. And he did that not for himself because he needed it, but he did it for us to show us that his resurrection was real. That he wasn't some ghost. It wasn't just a story, but the fish was missing and Jesus ate it. He had to be real. Everything he did was for you. Every moment he lived for you. And I have some bad news for you. Your spouse doesn't do that. They don't live every moment of their life for you. They just don't. They have too many other commitments. They have their fallen, sinful nature dragging them into things they shouldn't be doing. You maybe at times may even annoy them. They don't love you every moment of their life. Only Jesus Christ does. People often talk about having Christ as a part of their marriage. What does that mean? It means this, that his love and his forgiveness is what binds us together. His love is what creates a bond that is unbreakable and unshakable. That the things we may desire from our spouses, we can actually receive in Jesus Christ. Point number 5 says this, for us to seek God together. It says this, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. It says, for no one ever hated his own flesh. Notice, ladies, he's talking to men. Men love mirrors. Ladies usually don't. Right? His own flesh nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does for the church. It says, because of this we are members of his body. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. But he says this is a profound mystery. He says, I am saying it refers to Christ and to the church. However, it says, each one of you should love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. We're called to give ourselves up for one another. We're called to do that. We're called to be Christ to each other. That's the whole idea. That's why God gave us spouses. Because he's in heaven and he wants us to have a tangible reminder of his love. That's our goal, is to be Christ to each other. But the wonderful news is as well that when we fail to do that, we have Christ in the middle of us. And so when we're not the perfect spouse, we have Christ's forgiveness. When our spouse isn't the perfect spouse, they also have Christ's forgiveness. And he's called us to love and forgive them. Elsewhere, in Ephesians chapter 5, he reminds us, husbands, to see our wives as holy and perfect, not because they are, but because he has made them that way. To have those eyes of Jesus for one another. Throughout the Psalms, David, oddly enough, reminds us to remember the wife of our youth. As time goes on, as we change, he encourages us to continue to see our spouse as beautiful and as perfect as they were the day that we met them, or the day that we married them. To see them with that grace. Ladies, as you seek understanding from your husband, if he's as about as understanding as I am, then Jesus is the best place to get your understanding. Right? And they're also forgiven. And as we give one another that forgiveness, we build stronger bonds. Oddly enough, this works in reverse. Our strong bonds are not built by being the perfect spouse, but by recognizing that we're not. And loving and forgiving each other. Accepting one another, those bonds become stronger and stronger and stronger. And the love of Jesus Christ is shared with one another deeper and deeper. There's a couple ways to encourage this. They are intimacy builders. Intimacy with one another and also intimacy with God. Our title says this, Seeking God Together. Two challenges for us. One is to actually pray with your spouse. If you've never done that before, that may seem very, very odd. You can start by praying silently in the same vicinity together. Maybe come closer and closer. Maybe take turns praying out loud. Maybe not even for each other, just with each other. And then eventually sharing your needs and praying and lifting them up for one another. That is an incredible bond builder in our life. And also just being here, worshiping together, is an opportunity to be bound together as God's people. Reminded that His love has the ability to build a much deeper bond in our life than our own love for one another. Our Lord Jesus Christ has given us one another as tangible examples, just like He gave us this meal as a tangible example of His love. You know, God is big on object lessons. He is big on taste and see and feel what His love is all about. And so on the very night before He gave His life for us on the cross, the most loving, the most selfless act of all time, He took bread, and given thanks, He gave it to His disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body, which is given for you. This is in remembrance of me." In the same way, after they'd eaten, He took the cup. When He'd given thanks, He gave it to His disciples and said, "Take and drink. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you for the forgiveness of all of your sins." His feast is ready. We come to His feast.